Hearty welcome to Ms. Campbell Brown and the Facebook team who is present here today. It's a great occasion for us. And I must tell you, Ms. Brown, that you are very lucky for us. Only 2 days back I told my students that they are going to be a lucky batch. And I am delighted to inform you that the University Grants Commission has recommended IIMC as a university. We know what all we did to get this. There have been so many attempts which were made in the past, but we were not able to, we just could not succeed. We had to even get panels which were against this status. We had to replace them. But I'm happy that finally that journey of getting the UGC recommendation, we have succeeded in it. And the UGC proposal is going very soon to the Ministry of Human Resource Development. And once that happens, we will get a letter of intent. And hopefully, this academic session itself, that would be my dream, to get it realized. And if that happens, well, I hope that we would be able to start a PG program in which some of you who are interested can, after your diploma, you can join that. Let's hope for the best. And this could not have been at a more opportune time than this. I remember immediately after taking over, Prime Minister Modi had visualized a national communication university for this country. And no other institution in India can certainly dream of becoming the National Communication University of India. Only IIMC can. So that day we decided that we are going to pursue this dream and make his vision true. And I'm happy that this has happened. And for a national communication university, we will of course remain the Indian Institute of Mass Communication. Our name will not change. But for this, it is important that we have international partnerships. And I'm happy to inform you again, thanks to the Facebook team with which we have been working, we have been closely associated, and the efforts put in by the HOD New Media, Dr.Anubhuti Yadav, we may have perhaps the only one of its kind Facebook-supported media lab in the whole world. And of course we have to have an MOU, and before that we need clearances from different ministries, and our effort would be to ensure that that happens at the earliest. And for me, the earliest is that before your batch moves on, you will get an opportunity to work in that lab. For me, that's the target. Let's hope we will be able to achieve the best. Friends, it's a great honor for IIMC that we have been receiving some of the finest media persons from across the globe. And you are indeed fortunate that on the third day of your entry into this institution, we have not only one of the finest journalists in America, but also the head of news partnerships at Facebook, Ms. Campbell Brown with us. So warm welcome, Ms. Brown and the entire Facebook team. Today, instead of a lecture, it would be a different format. Dr. Anubhuti would be interacting with her on a one-to-one basis. And if you have any questions, then certainly I'm sure that Ms. Brown, who has always asked questions, the most difficult questions, she would be responding to perhaps the most difficult questions from your end. So thank you once again, Ms. Brown and the Facebook team, for this great collaboration that we are going to have. We are going to start a new journey with Facebook, and I'm sure that will change the face of social media in this country. Thank you so much.
How was your experience as a journalist? Because we'll come on to the Facebook and news partnership program later on, but since they are all journalism students, so how was your experience as a journalist? If you can share with us.
Of course. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. This is my favorite thing to do because I'm so excited to see so many people who are committed to becoming journalists, and given that the news business, I think all over the world, is going through such a massive transformation right now and disruption because of the internet and how we communicate differently. It's exciting to see so many people who feel passionately about journalism today and the importance of it and recognize that. And it's really inspiring for me to see you here in the audience ready to march down this path. For me, I actually majored in political science and thought I wanted to work in politics for a long time. And I took internships at different places in Washington, D.C. to try to get a job in politics. And I got a low-level job working for a congressman. It didn't pay very much. And I was trying to make some money on the weekends doing something else. And a friend worked at a TV station in Washington, D.C. and said, well, they're looking for weekend people who will intern. Are you interested? And as soon as I walked into the newsroom and I saw the reporters working, I knew instantly this was my home. And it was not until that moment that I had ever even thought of being a journalist. And I just kind of looked around and said, these are my people. This is where I'm supposed to be. And in journalism, I was young, I had no experience, I had this weekend internship, but traditionally in TV, the way it used to be is that you would start in a very small town and work your way up. And so I wanted to get a job on camera, and I sent, your resume was basically a videotape of all the work you had done. And I sent about 200 videotapes to all the smallest towns around the United States of America. And one called me, Topeka, Kansas, the NBC station in Topeka, Kansas, and I had never even been to Kansas. So I took the job, and it paid, well, in dollars, $6 an hour. It wasn't very much. And that was my start. And I remember just those early days of the first time I got in front of a camera to do my report, and they said, go, and the light came on, and I just froze. I froze, like a deer in the headlights, just like I didn't know what to do. And the cameraman was like, talk, talk, talk. And I was like, oh, okay. And I sort of came out of it, and that was the beginning. And I was glad to be in Topeka, where I made all of those kinds of mistakes in front of a very small audience. So it was Topeka, then Richmond, Virginia was my next job, then Baltimore, Maryland, and then Washington, D.C. And then so over the course of many years, bouncing around. And then when I got to Washington, D.C., the late Tim Russert, do you guys know Tim Russert, who hosted Meet the Press, a very famous journalist in the US who passed away some years ago, saw me on TV and we had a conversation, and he said, come aboard, let's try you out at National News. And he assigned me to cover George W. Bush's campaign when he was running for president against Al Gore. And that was the beginning. I was hooked, and I absolutely loved it. Absolutely loved it. It is so different and so much harder now than it was when I was a journalist. I had this conversation recently with Frank Bruni, who's a columnist for the New York Times, very successful journalist today. He and I were both young reporters covering the Bush campaign together. And the conversation we had recently was about how back then we had one story that we had to file at the end of the day. And we'd spend all day long working on our one story, checking our facts, getting it approved. He would write his story, I would do my piece for the evening news, and that was it. And then we would go to the bar, basically. There was no Twitter, there was no Facebook, there was nothing on social media that we were responsible for. It was just file your one story and then you're done for the night. And there was very little competition. So he was the New York Times reporter, there was a Washington Post reporter, I worked for NBC, there was CBS and ABC, but that was it. We were sort of the ones that mattered, and we didn't have that much competition. We were all close friends. We all sort of said and reported the same thing. Whereas I look today at the young political reporters who are trying to cover campaigns, and there are so many sources of information now that reporters have a really hard time standing out. So what you often see is journalists taking a stand on issues, sharing their opinions, doing reporting that has much more of a point of view in a way that I never would have. I mean, Tim Russert would have fired me if I said some of the things that I see journalists today openly tweeting, their views about politics. It just was, not allowed when I was in that role. But I think, when Frank and I were talking about why it's become so much more sort of allowed for journalists to share their opinions. And it is because of, I think, partly at least, because of the competition in the social media universe. If you don't have a different take or a different perspective on a story, it's hard to get noticed. It's hard to stand out, and it's hard to get people to read your story. And so there's just a different kind of journalism, I think, being practiced today that's not what I was doing in many ways. Yes, I think you can't uninvent the internet. We're not going backwards. And we also tend to idealize, I think, much of what that was like. Today, I think social media, it's already sort of taken over as the primary source for many, many people of news and information. In the US, I think it's about 50% of people get their news from Facebook. What the challenge now is what is the responsibility of the platforms, whether it's Facebook or Google or Twitter, because journalism, news organizations are having a very difficult time financially in this new environment. People, especially newspapers, are still, I would say, thriving here in India, less so in the US. They are really struggling. And don't know what the future holds, I think. Most of my friends, most of them work for newspapers or in television news, and they're all kind of looking for jobs right now. They're very nervous about what's happening, like how the evolution of the news business is going to play out. I'm optimistic because I do believe that Facebook, while not a news organization, we're not hiring journalists to do reporting, Facebook has a responsibility to the news industry. It's why we're here and why we're making the investments we're making in India and other places. We don't want to be the journalist, but we know, given the financial pressures, that we have to do a lot more to support journalism and make sure that the people who are doing good, reliable, accurate, quality journalism get the most visibility on Facebook, and that we are doing everything we can to support that kind of work. This is relatively new, truthfully. I mean, I was only hired by Facebook a year and a half ago to begin to figure this out, and we have, a growing team here in India now who have backgrounds in journalism to help us to make sure that, a company like Facebook, which is mostly engineers living in Silicon Valley, to make sure that they understand, that this company understands the importance of journalism, and that we do have a responsibility, and that we can be advocates inside the company for news organizations.
So you don't have to be nervous. There are a lot of jobs in the media, right? So now coming on to your present role, could you please tell us something about news partnerships and what's your role there, and what is Facebook doing, with the different news organizations here in India?
Yes. And I would just expand on what you said. Yes, don't worry, there are going to be lots of jobs. You all are the generation that is going to lead sort of the new revolution in journalism, because it will be different. And I think the people that are struggling are journalists who don't get social media and don't get that this is, basically the distribution channel for the work they're doing. So my role, when I was hired, it was just after the election in the US, where there was, a real problem with fake accounts and foreign governments trying to manipulate our election results. Fake news, false stories were a real problem, and this job was kind of undefined, and my conversations with Facebook were kind of like, look, we know we have a problem, we don't really know what to do with news, can you come help us figure it out? And a lot of the job at a sort of high level is trying to figure out what the future of journalism looks like. The way that you tell stories is going to be so different from how I used to tell stories. Everything will be on mobile. Video is so much more important. How you communicate the important information and boil it down in a way that people can understand in a very short period of time, because attention spans are not what they used to be. These are, it's just a different way of telling stories. And because you're of a different generation, are gonna, it's almost intuitive to many of you, sort of how to approach it. Social media is part of your life, it's always been part of your life. That's not true for many people that I worked with, and so they are really struggling with it. But it is, I do see a world where, it's social first. You're not necessarily writing for a paper anymore. I mean, this is way down the road, or you're writing for even a digital site or TV. It's all going to social media platforms. What I am focused on now, primarily, is working very closely with publishers here in India, around the world, to find business models that work. Because we have to make sure that journalism not only survives during this transition, but thrives. And it's not going to be necessarily the traditional old business model that works anymore. So many newspapers are moving to subscription. So we're working on how they can use Facebook to build their subscription business. Figuring out how to monetize video better so that it can really make money for those news organizations that are working in video is a huge priority for us. So I think getting the business piece right, I mean, you're mostly journalists, so we don't, journalists don't like to think about the business side of things necessarily, but increasingly you have to, because this change in business models is going to impact all of you, and we need to get this right. And it's really important, and it's going to be kind of an experiment in the years to come to ensure that we get it right.
So the most important is, when we are talking about, the changing habits of, audience, the way they are consuming media messages, I mean, it's changing. And since, it is changing, then we also have to focus on, how to package information in a different way. In fact, I just want to share with you, because I was at Google. Yesterday, there was this one journalist from Indian Express. She was sharing her experience. She was heading the digital team there. She said that the competition nowadays amongst reporters and journalists is not that, whether their story will appear in the newspaper or not, but the competition is, as a digital head, whether I'm pushing their story on social media or not. They said she said that every time, I have around 15, 20 journalists, and they are telling me to push their stories. So, and the reason is that people are consuming stories from Facebook, from Twitter, and from online medium. So that's very important. Another thing is that, when you're talking about this Facebook journalism project, here we have journalism students. How can they benefit from this particular project?
So the Facebook Journalism Project, we launched shortly after I started at Facebook, and it has sort of 3 pillars, kind of 3 areas of focus. One has been working together with news organizations to build products. So what used to happen at Facebook was a bunch of engineers in Silicon Valley would come up with an idea of what they thought journalists might use, and they would build it and put it into Facebook, and then the journalists would go, this isn't what we needed. This doesn't work like, I need it to work. And they just weren't working in a collaborative way with the news industry to get this stuff right. So now we have basically groups of news organizations, representatives who sit down with our engineers and say, this is what we need. This is what I need to do my story. Can you build me that? This is what I need in order to find information. This is what I need on Facebook to give more visibility for my story. I'll give you one example. It's a test we're doing here in India right now for breaking news. So one of the hard things about Facebook is when there's a big story, a big breaking news story, it's hard to find it on Facebook. So we're adding a breaking news label, allowing news organizations to add that label during breaking news so that it's easier to track and people will recognize that it stands out and it's different from every other thing in their feed. And it's a simple thing, but it's something that the engineers wouldn't have come up with. It required a journalist saying, hey, I need some sort of label on my story for breaking news so that people know this is more important, that stands out from everything else in my newsfeed. And then we get it done. So it's, this sounds really simple, but it wasn't happening before. So building products for Facebook with reporters, with news organizations is an important piece of what the Facebook Journalism Project is now doing. The second pillar is about tools and training for newsrooms and journalists. And that we have done a number of news, we call them news days, where we will bring all of our people in who are trained on the various tools we have, and sit down with groups. We'll do it sometimes in your newsroom or outside with groups of journalists, groups of reporters to show you how to use all the various tools that are available to you through Facebook, like CrowdTangle, which is it's a company we own that's part of Facebook now that helps you find out like how your stories are doing on social media and how other people's stories are doing on social media. But there's a lot that I think is, you're not going to necessarily know about unless we do real training around our programs. So that is an area where we're really investing going forward. The third piece, the third pillar of the Facebook Journalism Project is tools and training for people. Given the challenges that we have with false news, and I should be clear, we've done a ton of work over the last 2 years, a ton of investment in trying to address those problems, to get fake accounts off the platform, to reduce distribution for stories that are false or get flagged by our third-party fact checkers. We have a new fact-checking partner here in India called Boom that's working with us. So while all of that is really important, there's also a big education component that's equally important around news and digital literacy. I have 2 young children, ages 8 and 9, and they're probably not going to ever open a textbook in their lives, when you think about it. Probably most of the information they get as they go through school will be from online sources, will be from the internet. But they're not being taught the skill of how to be discerning about the information they get. And so this isn't a skill set that we needed because there weren't that many sources of information. So we need to, and these are some of the things we're funding, curriculums and programs to teach people how to identify quality news, how to know what's opinion versus fact, how to be skeptical about certain news sources. It's really important that we take part in that education process throughout people's lives because we can do a lot to reduce the amount of fake news on Facebook or and the other platforms too, but it's never going to go away. It's like crime. You can reduce it, but it's never going away. And in fact, it's going to get more complicated when you see technology and what they can do with video now, where you'll see, it looks like Donald Trump, but is it a robot Donald Trump saying this? And you don't know, is it the real thing, is it the fake thing? Trying to determine what's real and fake in video gets super complicated, and it's where we're spending a lot of money and putting a lot of resources today. So combining that with real investments in education and news literacy is a huge responsibility for us and something I believe we have to do.
Just, if I can say, I know that was the last thing, I really enjoyed this. This will, no doubt, this is a big trip. I'm going to Singapore and then Sydney, Australia, but this is the only place I'm actually getting time with journalists and students and true journalists. Everywhere else, it's the business people. So thank you. This is the most fun for me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Campbell. Thank you for coming here. Thank you for accepting our invitation. And definitely, we would like to invite you again when we'll inaugurate that media lab. So, DJ is sitting right here, so we have to fast track that, and if we want Campbell to come here again. So, thank you very much once again, and thanks a lot to the Facebook India team. Mr. Shivnath Thupral, Niharika is there, Ashish is there, and other people. Thank you very much. It wouldn't have been possible without your support. It was your initiative. You told us that Campbell is coming, and that's how we could invite us. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.